February 14th, 1943. Kasserine Pass, western Tunisia. A cold wind swept across the jagged ridges of the Atlas Mountains as the rising sun revealed a sight few American soldiers had ever imagined facing. Dust clouds billowed on the horizon, not from a sandstorm, but from engines. Dozens of engines. The deep growl of armored columns rolling through the morning haze. Inside an observation position dug into the hard, stony ground, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, Patton's son-in-law and commander in the 1st Armored Regiment's forward elements, lifted his binoculars, expecting perhaps a reconnaissance probe or scattered patrol. What he saw instead froze him. German Mark III and Mark IV tanks in disciplined formation gliding across the valley floor, half-tracks packed with infantry following in a tight wedge. 8-wheeled armored cars moving like wolves around the flanks, and above them all, the black silhouette of a staff car with a pennant fluttering. At its head sat one of the desert's most dangerous tacticians, General Erwin Rommel's protege and battlefield instrument, the veteran Afrika Korps elements that had spent 3 years carving their reputation into the sands of North Africa. This was not a probe. This was not a raid. This was a full-scale hammer strike, and the Americans were the anvil. For weeks, Allied intelligence had convinced itself that the German army in Tunisia was exhausted, low on supplies, unable to mount large-scale operations. But the Americans were new to desert warfare, new to combined arms fighting, new to the brutal calculus that veterans of El Alamein, Tobruk, and Gazala already knew by heart. And now, as the lead German tanks accelerated toward the American positions, the reality became unmistakable. The United States Army was about to face its first major battle against the full, concentrated force of the German military in North Africa. And it would be a disaster so complete, so shocking, so humiliating, that it would transform the American military forever. A new army meets an old enemy. The American units holding the entrance to Kasserine Pass had never fought a large, coordinated armored assault. Many soldiers had fired live rounds only during basic training. Others had never seen a tank attack at all. Officers were inexperienced. Logistics were fragile. Cohesion between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support was clumsy at best. The Germans, by contrast, had mastered this battlefield years before. On the ridgeline above the pass, German officers studied American positions through field glasses, noting with satisfaction the scattered placement of artillery, the lack of overlapping fields of fire, the overextended road network, the exposed supply nodes. Like a door left slightly open, one officer remarked. The Americans did not yet understand what the Germans learned in Russia, France, and the desert. A defensive line is not a wall. It is a system, and this system had gaps wide enough to drive a panzer regiment through. At 8:30 a.m., the German artillery opened fire, accurate, concentrated, and devastating. Shells rained onto the American front lines, ripping through tents, trucks, and hastily dug foxholes. Communication lines snapped instantly. Confusion spread, then panic. A private from the 158th Infantry later recalled, "We didn't know where the shells were coming from. It felt like the whole mountain was exploding." The German tanks charged forward moments later, engines roaring, turrets traversing as machine guns spat tracer fire. American anti-tank crews, stunned by the bombardment, scrambled to load shells into their outdated 37mm guns that in training seemed sufficient, but in reality could barely scratch a Mark IV's frontal armor. The shells bounced harmlessly off the German tanks. The return fire did not. Where is our air support? American doctrine believed aircraft would break up enemy armor before it reached friendly lines, but the weather over Tunisia that morning was thick with winter haze. Allied aircraft were grounded. German Stukas were not. The scream of dive bombers tore across the valley as they plunged into American positions, releasing bombs that lifted men and vehicles into the air. Some soldiers later described the sound as a metal shriek that stayed in their nightmares for decades. The first cracks. Within 2 hours, the American forward battalions were overrun, Tanks burned on the roadside. Jeeps lay crushed under treads. Ammunition trucks detonated like rolling fireballs. Officers attempted to form new defensive lines, but German infantry, riding on tank hulls, dismounted and swept through American positions with veteran precision. Mortar teams deployed in seconds. Machine gun crews established interlocking fire patterns with mechanical efficiency. The German advance was not just fast, it was methodical. One American officer wrote in his diary, "It was like watching a steel wave roll forward. We were not stopping it. We were barely surviving it." By noon, the situation had deteriorated so badly that headquarters lost contact with entire companies. The pass, narrow, steep, and critical, became a funnel of chaos. Vehicles collided as they attempted to retreat. Abandoned equipment piled alongside the road. Soldiers ran through choking smoke, unsure where to form new lines. For many, this was their first battle. For the Germans, this was routine. And the most terrifying part? This was only the beginning. February 15th, 1943. Somewhere west of Sidi Bouzid, dawn broke over a landscape littered with burnt-out armor, shattered radio trucks, abandoned machine gun nests, and hundreds of shell craters dotting the Tunisian desert. Smoke drifted across the plain in thin gray veils. The air still carried the metallic taste of cordite. Coyotes circled the edges of the battlefield. The American command staff expected that the German assault had reached its limit. It had not. To German commanders, General Heinz Ziegler and General Friedrich von Broich, the previous day had been nothing more than the shaping phase. Their goal was not merely to inflict casualties, it was to create panic, disrupt command structures, and unsettle the inexperienced American formations long before the decisive blow fell. The Americans, however, interpreted their temporary pause as an opportunity to rebuild. It was a fatal miscalculation. We are not facing patrols. We are facing an army. Colonel Alexander Stark, commanding the 26th Infantry Regiment, was one of the first to grasp what was unfolding. Surveying the horizon through binoculars, he saw German engineers clearing minefields with terrifying speed. He heard the rhythmic clank of treads echoing through the mountain passes. He noticed the growing precision of German artillery ranging shots, walking methodically across the valley floor. These were not probing attacks. This was preparation for breakthrough. Meanwhile, at Hunt Corps headquarters in Tebessa, Major General Lloyd Fredendall issued contradictory orders. American units were instructed to hold at all costs, then withdraw if necessary, then prepare counterattacks, all within the span of a few hours. Veteran British officers observing the U.S. situation were stunned. One later remarked, "Never had I seen a commander issue so many orders without forming a plan." The Germans, by contrast, issued almost none. They didn't need to. Their doctrine was instinct, drilled through years of combined arms battles. The German hammer falls. At 9 a.m., the desert floor began to vibrate. Men felt it through their boots before they heard the engines. Two panzer groups, elements of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, swung toward American lines in a coordinated pincer. Their movement was not improvisational. It was the execution of a classic German tactic. Fix the enemy with infantry, destroy him with armor, and punch through at the weakest point. American artillery did fire back, but with slow, inconsistent coordination. Forward observers were inexperienced. Some radios malfunctioned, others were destroyed. Several batteries were positioned too far to support the forward troops. Shells landed minutes late, often after German tanks had already passed. In contrast, German artillery was devastatingly precise. It struck American command posts, fuel depots, ambulance stations, supply trucks, communication lines. Each hit was deliberate. One American survivor remembered, "It felt like they could see through the mountains. Every time we moved, the shells followed." The American tank line crumbles. The U.S. 1st Armored Division attempted to form a defensive screen. But most of their tanks were M3 Lees and early model M4 Shermans, machines that were powerful but used improperly. American doctrine placed tanks in scattered groups, often without infantry support or recon screens. German doctrine concentrated tanks like a fist. When the two forces met, the result was immediate. German Mark IVs knocked out Shermans at long range. American crews returned fire too late or from poor angles. U.S. tank destroyer units held fire too long, waiting for perfect shots. German anti-tank guns, hidden among rocks, tore through American armor with surgical accuracy. By noon, the desert was filled with smoking holes. A German officer wrote in his journal, "The Americans fight bravely, but without method. Their courage exceeds their experience. Retreat turns into collapse." American forces attempted to pull back through the narrow mountain roads leading toward Kasserine Pass. But the road network was never designed to sustain thousands of men retreating under pressure. It quickly became a funnel of chaos. Trucks collided with tanks, jeeps overturned on rocky slopes, artillery horses panicked and broke free, ammunition crates spilled across the road, wounded men clung to passing vehicles, supply units intermingled with frontline troops. In one infamous moment, a traffic jam of American vehicles blocked the only exit route. German artillery bracketed the road, turning it into a killing zone. A private from the 19th Engineer Regiment later said, "We weren't retreating anymore. We were running for our lives." German confidence peaks. The rapid collapse astonished even the German commanders. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring reported back to Rome, "The Americans possess immense resources but lack cohesion. Their commanders do not control their troops. Their troops do not trust their commanders." He concluded with a line that would haunt the American High Command. "If we push now, Second Corps will disintegrate." And so, the push continued. The pass itself is now in danger. By the end of February 15th, German forces were dangerously close to achieving something that would have changed the war in North Africa: a complete penetration of the American lines, isolating Allied forces, and capturing Tebessa, Eisenhower's main logistical hub. In the words of one British intelligence officer, if Tebessa fell, North Africa might have fallen with it. The Americans were being pushed back toward Kasserine Pass, a narrow, steep-walled corridor that would become the stage for one of the most humiliating defeats in U.S. military history. But what neither side knew was this: the destruction of two corps would soon give birth to a completely new American army, one forged not by training manuals or war plans, but by the firestorm at Kasserine. February 20th, 1943. Tebessa, Algeria. The wind that swept across the American lines carried the smell of burning fuel, shattered metal, and something far more dangerous: humiliation. For 2 days, the battered remnants of two corps had been pouring into the rear areas, limping, bleeding, dazed, some still too shocked to speak. The Kasserine Pass, the Americans' first major test against the experienced German Africa veterans, had become a brutal lesson in the mathematics of modern war. Rommel had broken through green American divisions with terrifying speed, using tactics the U.S. commanders had only read about in manuals but never actually seen on a battlefield. And now, in the smoking aftermath, the U.S. Army faced a choice: either learn faster than any army in history or cease to exist in North Africa. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, whose headquarters sat absurdly 70 miles behind the front, dug into a reinforced bunker blasted into a mountainside, was already losing the confidence of his own officers. They whispered that he gave orders through messengers instead of visiting the front, that he used code words so confusing even his staff couldn't understand them, that he positioned his forces in ways that made no geographical sense. Rommel hadn't just defeated the Americans. He had exposed every flaw in their command system. But far from the front, another man had just arrived in theater, summoned by Eisenhower with a message that was neither gentle nor diplomatic. Lieutenant General George S. Patton did not study the ruins of Kasserine with sorrow or pity. He studied them with purpose. He walked among wrecked tanks, overturned half-tracks, smashed artillery pieces, and exhausted soldiers. He saw the problem immediately: men without discipline, units without cohesion, junior officers without initiative, a command structure that reacted instead of anticipated. In a letter that same night, Patton wrote, "The defeat at Kasserine is not the end. It is the beginning. I intend to hammer these men into the finest army ever to take the field." The next morning at 500, Patton took command of the Second Corps, and everything changed. Patton's first act was symbolic but devastating. He issued an order. From this moment on, any soldier not wearing a helmet will be punished. It sounded trivial, even petty. But what Patton understood, what many American generals did not, was that discipline is a muscle. If it failed in small things, it collapsed in big things. The Germans weren't simply better trained. They believed they were better trained. Patton intended to change that belief at the root. He toured every unit, sometimes appearing without warning, arriving at camps like a sudden storm of profanity, charisma, and volcanic energy. He replaced commanders who lacked aggression. He demanded marksmanship training at levels the Corps had never practiced. He forced logistics to operate on a 24-hour clock. He insisted that the men look like soldiers, shaved, boots polished, weapons clean. Patton knew a hard truth: no army fights better than it trains. Rommel's veterans had learned that through years of combat. Now, the Americans would learn it in weeks. Meanwhile, the German high command misread everything. Their reports described the Americans as soft, inexperienced, disorganized. In short, not a threat. Kasserine reinforced biases German officers had held since 1941, that the Americans were harmless amateurs backed only by machines. Field Marshal Kesselring famously joked, "They have good planes and good trucks, but they are not soldiers." It was a mistake Germany would pay for with its future. As Patton rebuilt the II Corps from the ground up, another transformation began. The soldiers themselves started to believe. They trained harder. They moved faster. They learned the battlefield lessons carved into them by the humiliation at Kasserine. Officers studied German tactics obsessively: infiltration, flanking, feint attacks, combined arms. The Americans learned to coordinate tanks with artillery and infantry instead of scattering them across the battlefield as they had before. They reorganized supply chains, redesigned tank formations, and restructured communication lines. Every weakness Rommel exposed was now being reinforced. Every deficiency had become a forged strength. By early March 1943, the II Corps that emerged from Patton's reorganization was not the same force that had been shattered in the past. It was an army preparing for revenge. And Rommel, sick, exhausted, and increasingly at odds with Berlin, had no idea what was coming. The Americans he had defeated at Kasserine were gone. What stood in their place was something new, something dangerous, something he had never faced before: a modern, flexible, disciplined American fighting force, the one that would eventually break through Europe, crush the Wehrmacht's defenses, and advance all the way to the heart of the Reich. Kasserine had not been the Americans' end. It had been their creation, their crucible, their awakening. And soon at Guettar, the desert itself would witness the moment the U.S. Army shed its old skin and announced to the world that it had arrived. March 23, 1943, Guettar Valley, Tunisia. The first rays of sunlight cut across the jagged hills, revealing a battlefield that looked quiet. Too quiet. The stillness deceived the inexperienced observer, but not the men of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division. They had learned painfully and recently that silence in North Africa usually meant only one thing: the Germans were coming. Patton had placed his finest division, the Big Red One, at the spear point of his newly rebuilt the II Corps. He trusted them. More importantly, he knew they trusted themselves. Their commander, Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, a combat leader forged in grit rather than parade ground shine, had no illusions about the enemy. He told his men bluntly the night before, "Rommel is wounded, but not dead. Tomorrow he will test whether we are soldiers or survivors." Rommel's replacement in the sector, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, had decided on a familiar tactic, a surprise armored assault meant to break American lines with shock and speed. Just as had happened at Kasserine, he believed the Americans would panic. He believed they would flee. He believed the lessons of Kasserine were permanent. He was wrong. At 0530, the ground began to tremble. Minutes later, the dust clouds appeared. Rising columns of sand kicked up by treads. Dozens of Mark III and Mark IV tanks, accompanied by elite Panzer grenadiers, rolled toward the American positions. They advanced with confidence, even contempt, expecting once again to cut through green troops like a blade through cloth. What they found instead was an American army reborn. Patton had placed the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion in concealed positions along the valley floor. The Germans didn't see them. They didn't expect them. They didn't believe the Americans capable of such disciplined concealment. The first American shot did not miss. A hidden 75mm gun punched clean through the lead Mark IV and turning its turret into a fountain of steel fragments. Two more German tanks brewed up seconds later. The valley erupted. For the first time in the war, German tank crews faced American fighters who didn't break. Artillery roared from the heights. Anti-tank guns fired with a calm, professional cadence. American infantry used the terrain intelligently, falling back only to draw the Germans into crossfire. This was not Kasserine. This was something far more dangerous. The Germans advanced again, and again the Americans absorbed the blow, then counterpunched with precision. At 0730, von Arnim committed his main armored thrust. 50 tanks surged forward. They expected to overrun the thin American line. Instead, they hit a wall. The 1st Infantry's anti-tank gunners held their fire until the Germans were well within range, Patton's new discipline in action. Then, an avalanche of shells tore into the panzers. Explosions lit the valley like a string of brutal fireworks. An American captain shouted, "Hold steady! Make them pay for every yard!" They did. One German tank after another burst into flames. Crews bailed out only to be cut down by infantry fire. The advance stalled, then wavered, then collapsed. For the first time in North Africa, German armored veterans began to retreat from an American line. Von Arnim was stunned. This was not the army Rommel had scattered at Kasserine weeks earlier. This was something forged, hammered, hardened. An army suddenly capable of absorbing German blows and delivering stronger ones in return. Later that afternoon, American artillery unleashed a counter-bombardment so intense that captured German officers later described it as a level of fire we had only seen on the Eastern Front. The Big Red One advanced, pushing the Germans back through the valley, reclaiming ground Americans had never before held. Patton visited the battlefield hours later. He saw the burning armor. He saw the men, exhausted, dust-covered, proud. He removed his gloves slowly and said, "This is what victory looks like. Remember it, because we will see it again." Guettar was not merely a tactical win. It was psychological transformation. The moment the Germans realized the Americans had crossed a threshold. The defeat at Kasserine had not broken them. It had created them. Their fear was gone. Their discipline was forged. Their leadership was sharpened. Their tactics were reborn. And the world's most mechanized democracy had found its war footing. The United States Army, the army that would storm Normandy, break the Siegfried Line, cross the Rhine, and tear apart the European war machine, was born in the dust and fire of Guettar. Rommel later wrote privately, "The Americans recovered faster than any army I have ever seen. Their improvement was astonishing. The Germans had taught them the cost of unpreparedness. The Americans had learned the lesson, and now the teacher would become the student." March 23, 1943. Dawn had not yet broken when the first rumble of engines rolled across the valley east of Guettar. The sound was unmistakable, deep, metallic, steady. Not trucks, not half-tracks, tanks. But this time, The Americans did not panic. They did not scramble from foxholes or clutch rifles with trembling hands. Instead, along the ridgelines overlooking Highway 15, riflemen of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, rose calmly into position. Machine gun teams set their tripods. Bazooka men checked their rockets. Forward observers unrolled signal wire across the rocks. Behind them, Patton's artillery, 48 guns from the 5th and 32nd Field Artillery Battalions, sat ready with shells stacked waist-high. Every man knew what was coming. General von Arnim had ordered the 10th Panzer Division, one of the most experienced armored formations in Tunisia, to smash 2 corps in a frontal assault, break through the valley, and reopen Axis supply routes. After Kasserine, he believed American lines would fold under armored pressure. He expected a rout. He would not get one. At 500 hours, the 1st German armor crested the distant ridge. Mark III and Mark IV tanks advancing in disciplined rows, engines snarling, their silhouettes sharp against the morning haze. To the Americans watching from dug-in positions, it looked terrifying. To their commanders, it looked exactly as planned. Patton had anticipated an armored assault. He had positioned his forces with precision. Infantry in the heights, anti-tank guns camouflaged along the approaches, artillery pre-sighted on every likely avenue of approach. As the German tanks advanced, a captain from the 18th Infantry whispered, "This time, we're ready." At 0530, the valley erupted. The first American volleys struck the leading tanks with brutal accuracy, 105mm shells detonating against armor, blasting treads off their wheels. German commanders, startled by the ferocity and precision of the opening barrage, ordered a rapid advance to close the distance. But Patton had planned for that, too. Hidden in wadis along the valley floor, American 37mm and 57mm anti-tank guns opened fire. The 37mm guns, hopelessly inadequate at Kasserine, were now used only from the flanks, at close range, where their shells punched through side armor. A sergeant shouted, "Let them come, then hit them in the ribs." For the first time in the North African campaign, American anti-tank crews did not break. They held their fire until the tanks were dangerously close, then unleashed a coordinated storm of armor-piercing rounds. German officers watching the attack noted something different, something unsettling. The Americans were fighting with discipline. Their fire was coordinated. Their lines did not waver. Their artillery responded instantly to calls for support. This was not the same army that had collapsed at Kasserine. At 0700, German infantry joined the assault. Waves of riflemen advanced behind the surviving tanks, pushing toward the American ridges. But the Big Red One held firm. Machine gun nests tore gaps through the advancing formations. Mortars dropped explosives with deadly precision into German assembly points. Every yard gained by the attackers was paid for in blood. And above all, Patton's artillery dominated the field. The commander of the 10th Panzer Division later described it. The American artillery fire was immediate, massive, and accurate. Every time we formed for attack, shells fell upon us as if triggered by our own movements. By noon, the German assault began to falter. 30 tanks burned in the valley, smoldering carcasses staining the morning sky with black smoke. The survivors tried to pull back, but American counter-battery fire found them, hammering the retreat with relentless precision. At 1400, von Arnim sent in reinforcements, another armored battle group, hoping sheer weight could break the American line. But the new tanks met the same fate. Forward observers signaled, "Armored column advancing, grid 28 Delta." Patton's artillery replied with a deafening roar. More tanks burned. More infantry fell. More German officers realized something they had never expected to witness in Tunisia. The Americans were outgunning them. The Americans were outshooting them. The Americans were outfighting them. By late afternoon, the assault collapsed entirely. The Germans withdrew in disorder, leaving the field and dozens of wrecked tanks to 2 corps. A corporal who fought at El Guettar recalled, "At Kasserine, we ran. At El Guettar, they ran. That was the day we knew. really knew that we could beat them. But for Patton, the greatest victory was psychological. His men had faced armor, the same weapon that had broken them weeks earlier, and held. They had stood their ground. They had fought as a unified army, and they had won. When Patton toured the battlefield after the fighting, he paused beside a burning Mark IV tank. Its turret lay blown open. Its track was twisted like ribbon. He tapped the armor with his riding crop and said quietly, "That's what discipline does." A staff officer near him later wrote, "It was the first time I saw him smile." El Guettar was not just a victory. It was a message to the Germans, to the Allies, and to American soldiers themselves. Two corps, once humiliated, had been reborn. And from that day forward, the Germans would never again underestimate American ground forces. April 1943. North Africa was dying. Not slowly, not gradually, but violently, like a collapsing structure whose supports had finally given way. And the greatest shock to the German High Command was this. The collapse was accelerated, not by the British Eighth Army, but by the very Americans they had mocked at Kasserine. After El Guettar, the transformed II Corps moved with a confidence that astonished Allied observers. These were no longer inexperienced troops stumbling through their first real campaign. They maneuvered like veterans. They coordinated like professionals. They attacked like men who had something to prove. Patton sensed this instantly. He pushed II Corps north, using speed and aggression to pry open German defensive lines. The pressure relieved Montgomery's Eighth Army from the south and forced the Axis to defend on two fronts, something their dwindling resources could no longer sustain. The race toward Bizerte. In early April, Patton launched a rapid advance across ridges, hills, and mined valleys toward the key port cities of Bizerte and Tunis, the last lifelines of Axis forces in Africa. German war diaries from this period show a dramatic shift in tone. Where they had once mocked American fighting ability, now they described II Corps with irritation and then alarm. A German intelligence captain wrote, "The Americans are fighting with new energy. Their artillery response time is nearly instantaneous. Their infantry no longer yields ground." By mid-April, the Americans had forced the Germans back toward the high ground, around Jebel Burda and Hill 609, towering positions that dominated the northern Tunisian landscape. If the Americans were truly a reformed army, this would be the test. Hill 609 became the proving ground. The assault on Hill 609, April 27th, May 1st, 1943. The hill rose more than 900 feet above the valley, a natural fortress covered with machine gun nests, mortars, and interlocking fields of fire. German commanders believed the Americans would attack head-on and fail. Instead, Patton gave the mission to Major General Charles Ryder and the 34th Infantry Division, veteran fighters who had absorbed Patton's new doctrine with unmatched discipline. The battle raged for 4 days. Machine guns tore down slopes like waterfalls of fire. Mortars exploded with terrifying accuracy. The Germans counterattacked again and again, determined to hold the height that anchored their entire line. But the Americans would not break. A lieutenant from the 168th Infantry wrote, "We were not the Green Boys of February. This time, we pushed until they moved." On May 1st, after hours of brutal hand-to-hand combat near the summit, the 34th Division seized Hill 609. That moment became the psychological turning point of the campaign. British observers sent a cable to London. "The Americans have come of age." German reports were even more revealing. "The enemy fights with determination equal to that of British infantry. We must revise our assessment of American capability." The fall of Tunisia. With Hill 609 in American hands, the German line fractured. Patton's II Corps surged forward, linking with British and French forces and sealing the fate of the Axis in Africa. On May 7, 1943, the British entered Tunis, the Americans entered Bizerte, and the last escape routes for the Axis closed forever. General von Arnim, the man who had once believed the Americans were the weak point, surrendered 2 days later with more than 230,000 German and Italian troops. The North African campaign was over. A victory forged not in triumph, but in humiliation, and rebuilt by discipline, steel, and the furious will of a commander who refused to accept weakness. What the German command finally admitted after the war, Allied interrogators asked German officers what had surprised them most about the Americans in North Africa. Their answers were blunt, almost embarrassed. General Bayerlein, Rommel's chief of staff, said, "We thought the Americans soft. We learned they were brave, very brave, once properly led." General von Arnim testified, "Their artillery was the finest we faced. Their ability to mass fire quickly was exceptional." One German colonel put it more simply, "They learned faster than any army we had ever fought." But the most extraordinary admission came from a captured intelligence officer whose reports had shaped German strategy in Tunisia. When asked why the German command had underestimated the Americans so drastically, he replied, "Because at Kasserine we beat them easily. At El Guettar, they beat us decisively. We did not expect an army to transform in 1 month." Then, after a long pause, he added, "General Patton was the difference." The legacy of Kasserine history often remembers Kasserine Pass as a humiliation. But in truth, it was something far more important. It was the fire that forged the modern United States Army. The soldiers who once broke under pressure at Thala and Sidi Bouzid would go on to land at Sicily, fight through Italy, storm Normandy, liberate France, and crush the Third Reich in its own heartland. They learned discipline, they learned speed, they learned coordination, and above all, they learned belief in themselves. No army transformed faster in the entire Second World War. What began as disaster became the foundation of victory. Kasserine was the defeat that created a new army. And El Guettar, Hill 609, Bizerte, and every battlefield that followed proved that America had risen from its own ashes stronger, harder, and determined never to be humiliated again. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe if you'd like us to continue telling stories like this one, stories that deserve to be remembered.